The photograph should have stayed blurred, but when artificial intelligence breathed clarity into the 125-year-old portrait, it revealed something that made seasoned archivists step back from their screens, something moving beneath a doll's lace veil where only porcelain should have been. If stories like this remind you how easily history hides its secrets, hit that like button and subscribe so more forgotten moments can be brought back to light. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and whether you think we'll ever know the full truth behind what really happened. Enjoy the story. The image arrived at the Digital Heritage Collective on a Tuesday morning in March 2025, uploaded by an estate liquidator in Yorkshire who had found it tucked inside a crumbling Bible. At first glance, it seemed unremarkable. A little girl, perhaps 6 years old, standing rigid in the formal Victorian manner, her dark dress buttoned to the throat, her expression unreadable through the fog of age and primitive photography. In her arms, she clutched a doll dressed as a bride, its face obscured by a delicate veil of antique lace. The sepia tones had faded to the color of old tea, and water damage had eaten away the bottom left corner, but the collective's mission was preservation, to rescue these fragments of human history from the erosion of time. Elena Vasquez had been working as a junior archivist at the collective for 18 months. She specialized in Edwardian-era photography, and something about this particular image caught her attention immediately. Perhaps it was the way the child's hands gripped the doll, not with affection, but with what looked like fear. Or perhaps it was the strange composition, the background slightly out of focus, showing what appeared to be the ruins of a building, charred beams visible through broken windows. Victorian portrait photography typically featured pristine parlors or professional studios. This looked like it had been taken at a disaster site. She fed the photograph into their latest AI enhancement software, a neural network trained on thousands of period-accurate images to reconstruct missing details and sharpen degraded emulsions. The process would take several hours. Elena made herself a cup of tea and returned to cataloging a box of Crimean War daguerreotypes, but her mind kept drifting back to that strange little girl and her veiled doll. When the enhancement completed at 3:30, Elena almost dropped her mug. The restored image possessed a clarity that seemed impossible for a photograph taken in 1900. Every detail had been sharpened. The intricate lacework of the girl's collar, the individual strands of hair escaping from beneath her bonnet, the texture of the doll's silk wedding dress. But it was what the AI had revealed beneath the veil that made Elena's breath catch. Where porcelain features should have been, there was something else, a suggestion of movement, a dark hollow where eyes should rest, and what looked disturbingly like sharp exposed teeth gleaming through the translucent fabric. Elena blinked, leaned closer. The effect was subtle enough to be dismissed as a trick of light and shadow, but once seen, it could not be unseen. The doll's posture, too, seemed wrong, its limbs bent at angles that suggested not craftsmanship, but organic flexibility, as if something inside the costume had frozen mid-movement. She uploaded the image to the collective's public forum that evening with a simple caption, 1800s portrait enhanced, unusual doll. Anyone recognize the location? Within 3 hours, the post had been shared 6,000 times. The comments section exploded into chaos. Conspiracy theorists claimed the AI had generated false details, a known problem with neural networks that sometimes hallucinated features that had never existed. Spiritualists insisted the doll was possessed, that the enhancement had revealed a trapped soul. Skeptics accused Elena of deliberate manipulation for attention, but several historians noted something else: the distinctive architectural style of the ruined building in the background, and what appeared to be a pattern in the burn marks on the surviving walls. Elena spent the next 2 days consumed by the image. She stopped sleeping properly, ate meals at her desk, and began a methodical analysis of every visible detail. The girl's clothing dated the photograph precisely, the style of her dress, the cut of her bonnet. Even the type of button used were all consistent with the period between 1898 and 1900. The photographic paper itself bore a manufacturer's watermark. She was able to trace to a Sheffield company that had operated for only 3 years at the turn of the century. But it was the background that fascinated her most. She isolated and enhanced that section, studying the burn patterns on the remaining stone walls, the distinctive Gothic archway visible through one collapsed section, the fragment of what looked like decorative ironwork. She cross-referenced architectural records, historic building surveys, and fire insurance maps from across northern England. On the third night, at 2 a.m, she found it. The ruins matched the remnants of Whitby Manor, a country estate that had burned to the ground in December of 1899. Elena's hands trembled as she zoomed in on the photograph's border, looking for any additional markings. There, barely visible in the enhanced version, was a photographer's backstamp pressed into the emulsion. A single line of text that read, "Taken 3 days after the Whitby wedding fire." What fire? And why had someone photographed a child at the scene of such a tragedy, holding a doll dressed as a bride? Elena's obsession deepened. She requested emergency access to the British Library's newspaper archives and spent a full Saturday scrolling through microfilm until her eyes burned. The fire had been extensively covered, front-page news across northern England for a full week in December 1899. The headlines grew progressively more horrified. Wedding tragedy, Manor Inferno claims 19 lives. Bride perishes on night of nuptials. No survivors among wedding party, only servants escape. The story that emerged was devastating in its simplicity. Clara Whitby, aged 19, daughter of one of Yorkshire's wealthiest merchant families, had married on the evening of December 20th, 1899. The ceremony had been held at the local church, followed by a lavish reception at the family's manor house. By all accounts, it had been a joyous occasion. The bride radiant, the groom devoted, the guests celebrating late into the night. Shortly after midnight, as the newlyweds retired to the bridal suite, fire broke out in the eastern wing of the manor. The blaze spread with horrifying speed. The manor was old, its timber dry, and a strong wind that night fanned the flames through room after room. Of the 32 people in the house, only 13 survived. All of them servants who had been quartered in a separate building or had been working in the kitchens when the fire started. The bride, the groom, both sets of parents, and 14 guests died in the inferno. The local fire brigade arrived too late to save anyone. By dawn, Whitby Manor was a smoking skeleton of stone and ash. The official inquiry concluded that a gas lamp in the library had been knocked over, perhaps by one of the guests who had drunk too much champagne. The death certificates listed misadventure as cause of death. The estate was inherited by a distant cousin who never rebuilt the manor. Within a decade, the ruins had been reclaimed by ivy and brambles, slowly collapsing into the earth. But Elena found something the official reports had missed. A small article from a regional paper dated December 28, 1899, a week after the fire. It described the funeral services held for the victims. Most of the bodies had been too badly burned for open caskets. The families had mourned before sealed coffins draped in black silk. The article mentioned the enormous turnout, the grief that had paralyzed the community, and one strange detail that the reporter had included almost as an afterthought. Among the mourners was noted a young child of uncertain relation who stood apart from the other attendees and whose name was not recorded in the service register. A child, at a funeral where 19 people had died. unnamed, unacknowledged. Elena cross-referenced the funeral records. The reporter had been correct. There was no child listed among the family members or invited mourners. She expanded her search, looking for any mention of children connected to the Whitby family or the wedding guests. And then she found it, hidden in the margins of a diary excerpt that had been donated to a local historical society decades earlier. The diary had belonged to Margaret Haynes, governess to several prominent families in the region. In an entry dated January 3, 1900, Margaret had written about visiting the ruins of Whitby Manor, describing the devastation in painful detail. But it was her final sentence that made Elena's pulse quicken. "They have sealed the inquiry, but I know what Clara tried to do. She would not leave without her child." Whose child? Clara Whitby had been 19, newly married on the night she died. The wedding announcement had made no mention of children. Victorian society would have made any existing offspring a prominent part of the celebration. So what child had Clara refused to leave behind? Elena knew she needed to find more letters, more primary sources, something that could explain the connection between the dead bride, the unnamed child at the funeral, and the little girl in the photograph holding a doll dressed in wedding clothes. She posted a request on several genealogy forums and historical research boards, carefully wording her inquiry to avoid revealing too much about the enhanced photograph, which had now been viewed more than 2 million times and spawned countless theories, none of which came close to the truth. 3 days later, she received a response from a librarian at a private collection in Durham. They had recently acquired a box of correspondence between Clara Whitby and her former governess, Margaret Haynes. The letters had been found during the renovation of an old cottage that had once belonged to the Haynes family. Would Elena like to examine them? She drove to Durham the next morning, arriving at the small, climate-controlled archive room where the letters waited in archival boxes, each envelope carefully preserved in transparent sleeves. There were 47 letters in total, spanning from Clara's 13th birthday in 1893 until 3 weeks before her death in 1899. Elena's hands shook slightly as she opened the first envelope. The paper was thick, expensive, the handwriting elegant and confident. Clara wrote to Margaret as both mentor and friend, describing her lessons, her social engagements, her thoughts on literature and music. But as Elena worked through the chronological sequence, the tone of the letters began to shift. In 1897, when Clara was 17, she began mentioning a little companion who lived in the manor's old nursery. At first, Elena assumed this was metaphorical, perhaps a pet or an imaginary friend that Clara described with affection, but the references grew more specific. Clara wrote about bringing food to the nursery, about reading stories aloud, about teaching simple songs. She mentioned keeping the room locked and asking the servants not to enter. Margaret's responses, preserved in a separate file, showed increasing concern. She gently suggested that Clara was too old for such fancies, that she should focus on her coming-out season and the prospect of marriage. Clara's replies grew defensive. She insisted the companion was real, that she had made a sacred promise, that no one could understand what she had endured. The letters from 1898 took on a tone of barely controlled desperation. Clara wrote about guilt, about trying to make amends for something terrible, about seeking absolution from a sin she could never fully articulate. She begged Margaret not to tell her parents, not to betray her confidence. In one particularly haunting passage, dated June of 1898, Clara wrote, "You think I have gone mad, but I assure you I am quite sane. The little one needs me. She has no one else. Sometimes I hear her crying through the locked door, and I know that I alone can quiet her. Mother would never understand. She thinks I should forget that time heals all wounds, but time has only made the wound deeper. I cannot let go. I will not let go. Margaret's final letter to Clara, dated November 18, 1899, exactly 1 month before the wedding and 5 weeks before the fire, was frank and pleading. She begged Clara to seek help, to confide in her mother or in her fiancé about whatever burden she carried. She wrote, "My dearest girl, you are about to begin a new life. You must release the past. Whatever tragedy you believe you must atone for, it is not your fault. You were a child. These things happen, and they are no one's fault. Please, I beg you, do not take this darkness into your marriage. Promise me you will let her go." Clara's response, dated December 15th, 5 days before the wedding, was short and final. "Dearest Margaret, I cannot promise what you ask, but I swear to you this: after the wedding, I will do what must be done. If anything happens, promise me you will keep her safe. Her soul must not wander alone. That is all I can say. Please do not worry for me. I know what I must do, and I do it with love. Your devoted Clara." Elena sat back in her chair, the letter still in her hands. The archive room was silent except for the hum of the climate control system. She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Clara's words, "I will do what must be done," took on a sinister weight when read alongside the fact that 5 days later she had died in a fire that consumed her entire family and wedding party. But the reference to "her soul must not wander" raised more questions than it answered. Was Clara speaking metaphorically? Was this Victorian spiritualism? Or was she referring to an actual person? And if the companion in the nursery was real, why had no remains of a child been found among the victims? Elena had reviewed the coroner's reports carefully. 19 bodies had been recovered from the ruins, all adults. The manifest was complete. Everyone who had been in the manor that night was accounted for, except for the servants who had escaped, and whoever had been locked in that nursery. Forensic records from 1900 were primitive, but Elena managed to locate the fire inspector's supplementary notes in a county archive. The eastern wing, where the fire had started, had been completely destroyed. The roof collapsed, the timbers reduced to charcoal, the stone walls cracked by the intense heat. The inspector had noted that the nursery, located at the far end of the eastern corridor, had burned so thoroughly that almost nothing remained. The floor had given way entirely, dropping the contents of the room into the cellar below. The inspector had written, "Debris removed from the nursery site showed remnants of furniture, children's toys, and what appeared to be doll components, porcelain fragments, fabric scraps, and unidentifiable organic matter reduced to ash. No human remains located in this section, though extreme heat may have caused complete cremation. Doll components, organic matter, complete cremation." Elena's mind raced. The doll in the photograph, dressed as a bride, its face hidden behind a veil, something dark and wrong visible in the enhanced image, had been made after the fire. The photograph had been taken 3 days after the blaze, which meant someone had commissioned and constructed the doll with extraordinary speed. But why? And who was the little girl holding it, standing among the ruins with an expression that Elena now understood was not just fear, but the weight of terrible knowledge? She needed to find out who had made the doll. The answer came from an unexpected source. 2 weeks after Elena had posted about her research on a Victorian crafts and mourning practices forum, she received an email from a man named David Brennan who lived in Whitby itself. His great-great-grandfather had been the town's premier artisan, specializing in memorial items, mourning jewelry, death masks, and memorial dolls. David had inherited his ancestors' ledgers and workshop records, preserved in his attic for over a century. When he saw Elena's post about the Whitby Manor fire and the mysterious doll, he recognized the case immediately. Elena drove to Whitby the following weekend. David met her at a small cottage overlooking the harbor, the same cottage where his ancestor had maintained his workshop. He led her to a converted attic space, where dozens of leather-bound ledgers lined built-in shelves, each spine labeled with a year. He pulled down the volume marked 1899 to 1900 and opened it to a page he had bookmarked. The entry was dated December 23, 1899, 3 days after the fire. The handwriting was cramped and efficient. Special commission, priority work. Memorial doll, bride's likeness, half scale. Materials, silk from wedding dress remnant, lace from trousseau, porcelain base, composite fill. Client requested expedited completion for memorial photograph. Additional materials supplied by client, ash samples, fabric fragments, and other organic matter of unspecified origin. Client insisted on sealed construction, no internal viewing permitted, payment in advance. Completed December 26th. Client collected at dawn. Below the entry, the artisan had sketched the doll, a careful pencil drawing showing the dress design, the veil arrangement, and the proportions. Elena compared it to the photograph on her phone. They matched exactly. This was the same doll the little girl had held while posing in the ruins. But it was the list of materials that made her stomach turn. Ash samples, fabric fragments, organic matter of unspecified origin, sealed construction. In the Victorian era, memorial dolls were sometimes made to commemorate the dead, but they typically contained locks of hair or small pieces of clothing, keepsakes, not ashes. And the phrase, sealed construction, no internal viewing permitted, suggested that whatever had been placed inside the doll was not meant to be seen. David noticed her expression. He told her that his great-great-grandfather had been troubled by this commission, troubled enough to make additional notes in the margin of the ledger. Elena leaned closer to read the cramped script. Client displayed signs of profound distress, insisted the doll must serve as a vessel, would not clarify meaning. When questioned about the organic matter, stated only, she must have somewhere to rest until she can truly rest. Payment was excessive, 5 times normal rate. The work left me uneasy. The materials, when combined, produced an odor I cannot adequately describe. The doll, when finished, seemed heavier than its components should allow. I was relieved when the client took possession. I hope never to see it again. Elena felt empathy stirring beneath her growing horror. The doll had not been created as a grotesque object or a tool of malice. It had been fashioned from grief, from desperate love, from the terrible human need to preserve what had been lost. Someone, presumably connected to Clara Whitby, had taken ashes from the fire, remnants of the wedding dress, and something else, something the artisan could not identify, and had sealed them inside a porcelain shell dressed as a bride. The doll was not evil, it was a coffin. But who had commissioned it, and who was the little girl forced to hold this vessel of grief for a photograph taken among ruins that still smoldered? Elena spent the next month chasing answers through census records, hospital admissions, and parish registers. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a psychiatric hospital in Leeds that had maintained meticulous records of its patients from the Victorian era. Among the admissions for 1900, Elena found an entry for a child named Lydia Haynes, aged 5, admitted in February of 1900 and released to family care in March of the same year. The admission notes were brief but illuminating. Child found wandering near fire ruins, clutching charred toy, non-responsive. 2 questioning. Family reports child sleeps poorly and speaks to imaginary companions. Child claims doll whispers in voice of her mother. Lydia Haynes. The surname was familiar. Margaret Haynes, Clara's governess. Elena cross-referenced genealogical records and found the connection. Lydia was Margaret's niece, the daughter of Margaret's sister who had died in childbirth in 1895 when Lydia was only 6 months old. Margaret had raised the child herself while continuing her work as a governess. When Margaret had been employed by the Whitby family, young Lydia would have accompanied her to the manor, would have played in those grand rooms, would have been known to Clara. Elena found Lydia's testimony in the fire inquest records, or rather, the lack of testimony. The inquest noted that a child had been present at the manor on the night of the fire, but had been deemed too young and too traumatized to provide reliable evidence. She had been removed from the scene by her Aunt Margaret and had not been called to testify. The official record stated only, "Minor child, name withheld, survived fire by unknown means, found outside the main structure, no injuries noted." But Elena discovered something else, a letter from Margaret to the inquest board, dated January of 1900, requesting that her niece not be compelled to testify. In her petition, Margaret had written, "The child has suffered enough. She was in Clara's care when the fire started. Clara sent her out through the nursery window before the flames reached that wing. What the child saw or heard, I cannot say. She will not speak of it. But she wakes screaming, and she clutches the doll Clara gave her with such force that we cannot pry it from her hands. To force her to relive that night would be cruel beyond measure." Clara had saved Lydia. In the moments before the fire consumed the nursery, Clara had pushed the child through a window to safety, but she had also given Lydia the doll, the memorial doll, that would not be created for another 3 days. That was impossible unless Elena's mind made the connection with a jolt that felt like falling. The doll in the photograph was not the original. The original doll, whatever Clara had kept in the locked nursery, whatever she had fed and sung to and called her little companion, had burned in the fire. The doll the artisan had created 3 days later was a reconstruction, a replacement, made from the ashes of the first doll and the ruins of Clara's wedding night. But why? Why recreate such a thing? Why photograph Lydia holding it among the ruins? And whose idea had been the photograph, a memorial or a warning? Elena knew she needed to find Margaret's personal papers, her private journals, anything that might explain what had happened in those terrible days after the fire. She traced Margaret's life forward. She had left Yorkshire shortly after the fire, moved with Lydia to Scotland, and died in 1943 at the age of 78. Her estate had been minimal. She had never married, had lived modestly, and had left her few possessions to Lydia, who by then was a middle-aged woman working as a teacher in Edinburgh. Lydia herself had died in 1986, never married, childless. Her estate had been settled by a local solicitor and her possessions dispersed. But Elena found a reference to a storage unit that had been maintained for 10 years before the contents were donated to a charity shop. Most of the items had been sold or discarded, but one box, labeled personal papers and correspondence, had been rescued by the shop manager who thought it might have historical value. It had eventually been donated to the Scottish National Archives. Elena requested access immediately. The box arrived from deep storage 2 weeks later, a battered cardboard container that looked like it had survived multiple moves and at least one flood. Inside were photograph albums, yellowed letters, postcards, and 3 leather journals. Elena opened the journals with trembling hands. The first 2 contained mundane entries, household accounts, recipes, observations about weather and daily life. But the third journal, which covered the years 1898 through 1900, was different. The entries started normally enough, but by late 1899, Margaret's handwriting had become agitated. The lines pressed hard into the paper. She wrote about her concerns for Clara, about strange requests Clara had made, about hearing crying from the locked nursery when she visited the manor. In an entry from November of 1899, Margaret had written, I confronted Clara today about the nursery. She finally told me the truth, and I wish to God she had not. The child, Clara's child, was born dead in the spring of 1897. Clara was only 17. She had been assaulted by one of her father's business associates at a company dinner. She told no one until it was too late. Her mother arranged for a midwife to attend the birth in secret. The baby never drew breath. It was a girl. Clara named her Rose. Elena stopped reading, her hands frozen on the page. She felt the weight of this revelation like a physical thing pressing against her chest. Clara Whitby, at 17 years old, had endured trauma that Victorian society would have blamed her for, had carried a pregnancy alone and in secret, and had given birth to a stillborn child that no one would acknowledge or mourn. The companion in the locked nursery, the little one Clara had fed and sung to, Rose, who had never lived but whom Clara could not let die. Margaret's journal continued. Clara preserved the child's body. I do not know how, whether she learned the technique from books or simply discovered it through desperate experimentation. She kept the small body in the nursery, dressed in fine clothes, surrounded by toys. She visited every day. She spoke to the child as if she were alive. Her mother and father knew, I think, but they chose to ignore it. They thought Clara would eventually accept the loss and move on. They were wrong. The longer Rose remained in that nursery, the more Clara became convinced that she could bring her back. She studied spiritualism, mediumship, ancient rituals. She truly believed that love alone could reverse death. The entry for December 18th, 1899, 2 days before the wedding, was short and desperate. Clara told me she plans to burn Rose's body on her wedding night. She believes it is the only way to free both their souls. She says the marriage is a new beginning and that she must let Rose go. I begged her not to do this alone, not to attempt some ritual that might end in tragedy. She kissed my cheek and told me she knows what she is doing. I fear what will happen. The next entry was dated December 21st, written in shaking handwriting. The manor burned last night. Clara is dead. Everyone is dead. Only the servants survived, and Lydia, my sweet Lydia, who should never have been there, but I had no one else to leave her with while I attended the wedding. Clara had asked Lydia to stay in the nursery. She said the child would be safe there, away from the festivities. When the fire started, Clara must have gone to the nursery. She must have pushed Lydia through the window, but she stayed inside. She stayed with Rose. Elena's vision blurred with tears. She understood now. Clara had planned to cremate Rose's preserved body, to perform some final ritual that would release both of them from the past. But something had gone wrong. Perhaps the fire had spread faster than Clara anticipated. Perhaps she had underestimated the age and dryness of the manor's timbers. Or perhaps, in that final moment, Clara had been unable to leave her daughter's body to burn alone. She had stayed in the nursery as the flames consumed everything, and she had died there, her body so thoroughly cremated that the inspectors had never found her remains. The coroner had identified 19 bodies, but Clara's had not been among them. She had been assumed to be one of the unidentifiable victims. Her name recorded on a memorial, but her actual body never recovered because it had been reduced to ash alongside her daughter's. The journal continued. I arranged for the doll to be made. Lydia was inconsolable. She kept asking for the toy Clara had given her, but it had burned. I went to the ruins and collected what I could find. Ashes from the nursery, fabric from Clara's wedding dress that had been stored in a separate building, fragments of Rose's clothing. I took these materials to an artisan and commissioned a memorial doll. I did not tell him what the ashes represented. I needed Lydia to have something to hold, something that would help her understand that Clara was gone but not forgotten. I thought it would bring closure. The final entry about the doll was chilling. I had the photograph taken 3 days after the fire. Lydia stands in the ruins, holding the doll, and I pray this image will somehow capture what I cannot say aloud, that Clara loved so deeply it killed her, that Rose was real even if she never lived, that grief can be transformed but never truly destroyed. Lydia will not look at me when I show her the photograph. She says the doll whispers to her in Clara's voice, and I do not have the heart to tell her it is impossible. Perhaps it is not impossible. Perhaps love does persist beyond death, sealed into ash and fabric and porcelain. Perhaps Clara found a way to keep her promise, that Rose's soul would not wander alone. Elena closed the journal and sat in the archive's reading room for a long time, watching dust motes drift through slanted afternoon light. She understood everything now, the photograph, the doll, the way Lydia's small hands had gripped the memorial vessel with such desperate strength. The AI enhancement had not revealed a monster. It had revealed grief given form, love pressed into the shape of loss, a mother and daughter bound together in ash, and whispered promises. She thought about the sharp teeth and hollow eyes the enhancement had shown beneath the veil. Were they real, or had the AI simply interpreted the doll's composite materials, the organic matter, the bone fragments that must have been mixed with the ashes, and extrapolated features that suggested something between human and construct? Or had Margaret been right, and some essence of Clara and Rose had actually been sealed into that porcelain shell, visible only when technology advanced enough to pierce the veil that had hidden them for 125 years? Elena wrote her article over the next 3 weeks, struggling to find words that would honor the truth. Without sensationalizing the tragedy, she titled it A Portrait of Grief, The Whitby Manor Fire and the Doll Made from Ashes. She published it on the Digital Heritage Collective's blog and posted links across the same forums where the enhanced photograph had first gone viral. The response was overwhelming. The previous comments, the mockery, the accusations of hoaxing, the crude jokes about haunted dolls were replaced by something else entirely. People shared their own stories of loss, of holding on to objects that contained the essence of people they had loved, of the terrible weight of grief that could not be expressed in socially acceptable ways. Mothers who had lost children, daughters who had lost mothers. The photograph transformed in the public consciousness from a curiosity into something sacred, a memorial not just to Clara and Rose, but to all love that persists beyond the acceptable boundaries of mourning. But Elena could not let it rest. She felt a responsibility to the photograph, to the story, to the souls that had been trapped in public speculation for over a century. She needed to see the ruins herself, to stand where the photograph had been taken, to understand what Lydia had felt holding that doll among the ashes of everything Clara had tried to save. She drove to Whitby on a cold afternoon in late October 2025. David Brennan had given her directions to what remained of the manor. It was on private land now, but the current owner was sympathetic to researchers and had granted Elena permission to visit. She parked her car on a muddy track and walked through overgrown fields until she found the ruins. They were smaller than she had imagined, reduced by more than a century of weather and neglect to little more than fragments of stone walls and a few sections of Gothic archway. Ivy covered everything, and trees had grown up through what had once been the Great Hall. But the shape of the place was still visible. The eastern wing where the nursery had been, the western wing where the servants' quarters had stood apart and survived, the main entrance where Clara and her groom had walked as husband and wife for perhaps an hour before the fire began. Elena walked carefully through the ruins, comparing the current layout to the photograph on her phone. She found the exact spot where the photographer had stood. She could tell by the angle of the archway and the distant line of trees visible in both images. She stood where Lydia had stood, a frightened 5-year-old girl holding a doll that whispered in her dead guardian's voice, posing for a photograph that would outlive everyone who had known the truth. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the broken stones. Elena had brought something with her, not the original doll, which she had not been able to locate, but a carefully crafted replica she had commissioned from a modern doll maker using Margaret's journal descriptions and the photograph as reference. She had not intended to make some kind of ritual gesture, but standing there in the ruins, she felt the need to complete something, to close a circle that had been opened 125 years ago. She walked to where the nursery had been. The floor had indeed collapsed into the cellar, and the depression was now filled with decades of fallen leaves and debris. She knelt at the edge and placed the replica doll carefully on a flat stone, arranging its veil so that it covered the porcelain face. And as she did, she heard something, faint, distant, perhaps only her imagination or the wind moving through the ivy, that sounded like a lullaby. It was a song she had read about in Clara's letters, a simple melody Clara had written about in her correspondence with Margaret, describing how she sang it to Rose every night. Elena did not know the tune, had never heard it performed, but somehow the sound that drifted through the ruins carried a melody that felt ancient and heartbreakingly tender. She stood and looked around. The ruins were empty. The sun had slipped below the horizon, and twilight was settling over the broken walls. But for just a moment, Elena felt a presence, not malevolent, not frightening, but simply there. A sense of completion, of something long held being finally released. The doll's veil stirred slightly in the evening breeze, and Elena could swear its expression had changed, that the hollow eyes and sharp teeth the AI had revealed were gone, replaced by something that looked almost peaceful. She took a photograph with her phone, the replica doll in the ruins, the Gothic arch in the background, the dying light making everything glow with soft amber. When she reviewed the image later, she saw what might have been a second figure reflected in the broken window behind the doll, a young woman in a long dress, her face turned toward the nursery site, her posture suggesting someone waiting for something precious to return. Elena did not post this photograph. Some things were not meant for public consumption, not meant to be enhanced by AI or analyzed by algorithms. Some truths existed in the space between documentation and faith, in the borderland where memory became mythology and grief transformed into grace. But she did one more thing. She filed a request with the local historical society to have a small memorial plaque placed at the ruins with text that read, "In memory of Clara Whitby, 1880 to 1899, and her daughter Rose. They rested here together, united by love that death could not diminish." The society approved the request, and the plaque was installed in the spring of 2026. Elena visited one more time after the plaque was placed, bringing flowers, white roses, the same flower Clara had named her daughter for. She left them at the stone where she had placed the replica doll, which was no longer there. She assumed someone had taken it, or perhaps animals had disturbed it, or perhaps it had simply dissolved back into the earth it had been meant to honor. She stood among the ruins as afternoon light turned everything golden, and she thought about Margaret's final journal entry, written in January of 1900. "I have done what I can. The doll is made, the photograph is taken, and Lydia sleeps more peacefully now. I do not know if Clara found what she sought in the flames. I do not know if Rose's soul is at rest, but I know that love persists beyond what we can measure or understand, and that is enough. We create memorials not to trap the dead, but to acknowledge that they lived and were loved. Perhaps that is all any of us can hope for, to be remembered not as we died, but as we loved." Elena returned to London with the weight of the story settling into her bones. The photograph, the original, the AI-enhanced version, the whole tangled history had become something more than a mystery solved. It had become a mirror reflecting back the fundamental truth of human existence, that we are all haunted by love, that grief is simply love with nowhere to go, and that the things we cannot release become the things that define us. The photograph continued to circulate online, but its meaning had shifted. Art students studied its composition. Historians used it to teach about Victorian mourning practices and the hidden lives of women. Grief counselors referenced it in discussions about complicated bereavement. The Digital Heritage Collective received dozens of similar photographs from people who had found old images in attics and estate sales, pictures that had seemed ordinary until examined closely, until their stories were excavated from archives and journals and fading memories. Elena became something of an expert in memorial photography, in the ways the Victorians had tried to preserve their dead through images and objects. She wrote papers about mourning dolls, about post-mortem photography, about the intersection of grief and technology. But the Whitby photograph remained her touchstone, the story that had taught her that every old photograph contains not just an image, but an entire world of human emotion pressed flat and waiting to be rediscovered. She learned through continued research that Lydia Haynes had lived a quiet life in Scotland, had become a teacher specializing in literature and history, and had never spoken publicly about the fire or the photograph. But Lydia had saved everything, every letter, every journal, every scrap of documentation related to Clara and Margaret and that terrible December night. She had created an archive of her own, a private memorial that she never intended to share, but could not bring herself to destroy. Perhaps she had known that someday someone would need to understand. Perhaps she had hoped that the truth would eventually outweigh the horror, that Clara and Rose would be remembered not as a Gothic tragedy, but as a testament to the extremes of maternal love. In her final years, Lydia had added her own testimony to the collection, a handwritten document dated 1985, 1 year before her death. Elena found a copy of this document in the Scottish archives, misfiled among unrelated materials. Lydia had written, "I am 89 years old now, and I remember that night as clearly as if it were yesterday. Clara saved my life by pushing me through the nursery window. As I fell into the bushes below, I looked back and saw her standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the flames. She was holding something small in her arms, a bundle wrapped in white cloth. She looked at me and smiled, and then she turned back into the fire. I did not understand then what she was doing or why. I understand now. She could not leave her daughter to burn alone. She chose to die with Rose rather than live with the guilt of letting her go. Some might call this madness. I call it love in its purest and most terrible form." Lydia continued, "The doll Aunt Margaret made for me after the fire was not haunted, whatever the doctors thought, but it did speak to me in its way. It reminded me that Clara had existed, that Rose had existed, that love had been real, even if its expression had been tragic. I kept the doll until I was 12, when I finally understood that Clara was truly gone and would not return. I buried it in our garden in Scotland, beneath a rose bush I planted myself. The roses bloom white every spring, and I like to think that somewhere, in whatever place souls reside, Clara sees them and knows that she was not forgotten." Elena sat with this testimony for a long time, feeling the narrative complete itself in her mind. The doll was gone, buried beneath a rose bush that might still be blooming somewhere in Edinburgh, tended by people who did not know what lay beneath its roots. The photograph remained, enhanced by artificial intelligence to reveal secrets that had been hidden for 125 years. and the truth had been excavated, documented, and transformed from horror into something approaching understanding. But Elena felt one more task remained. She contacted a documentary filmmaker she had worked with on previous projects and proposed a short film about the photograph. Not a sensationalized ghost story, but a meditation on grief, memory, and the ways technology allows us to see the past with new eyes. The filmmaker agreed, and they spent 6 months crafting a 20-minute piece that interweaved the enhanced photograph, readings from Clara's letters and Margaret's journals, interviews with historians and grief counselors, and footage of the Whitby ruins at different times of day and in different seasons. They titled the film The Bride's Lullaby, after the song Clara had sung to Rose. It premiered at a documentary film festival in Edinburgh in the fall of 2026, exactly 127 years after the Whitby Manor fire. The audience sat in silence as the film unfolded, as Elena's narration guided them through the layers of the story, as the enhanced photograph appeared on screen and the camera slowly zoomed in on the doll's veiled face, while a soprano sang a reconstructed version of Clara's lullaby based on melodic patterns common to Yorkshire folk songs of the period. When the lights came up, no one moved for a long moment. Then a woman in the third row began to cry, not dramatically, but with quiet, shaking sobs that spoke of personal recognition. Others joined her. The theater filled with the sound of collective grief being acknowledged and shared. Elena understood then that the story had transcended its specific details and become something universal, a reminder that behind every old photograph, every mysterious artifact, every historical puzzle, there are human beings who loved and suffered and tried to make meaning from loss. The film was later acquired by a streaming service and viewed by millions of people around the world. The comments section became a repository of stories, people sharing their own experiences with grief, with memorial objects, with love that had nowhere to go. Mental health organizations began using the film in training, sessions about complicated grief and trauma responses. Universities included it in courses on Victorian culture, the history of photography, and the ethics of AI enhancement. But for Elena, the most meaningful response came in an envelope that arrived at the Digital Heritage Collective 6 months after the film's release. It was postmarked from Edinburgh and contained a single pressed rose, white, perfectly preserved, and a note written in elegant handwriting that reminded Elena of the letters Clara had written to Margaret over a century ago. The note read, "Dear Dr. Vasquez, I am the great-great-niece of Lydia Haynes. I never knew her. She died before I was born, but my grandmother spoke of her often. When I saw your film, I understood for the first time why grandmother always insisted we tend the white rosebush in the old garden, why she became upset when I suggested we remove it to make room for a new patio. She said something I did not understand then. Let it bloom. Someone is sleeping there who needs to dream in white. I have been caring for that rosebush for 30 years now. It blooms more beautifully each spring. I am sending you one of this year's roses so that you know the story is not over, that the memorial continues, that Clara and Rose are still remembered, not as a tragedy, but as a testament to a mother's love. Thank you for telling their truth. Sincerely, Rose Margaret Talbot." Elena pressed the rose between the pages of Margaret Haynes's journal, the one that had started everything, the one that had revealed the truth behind the photograph. She placed the journal back in the archive with a note of her own, documenting how the rose had been sent and by whom, creating one more layer in the palimpsest of memory that surrounded Clara Whitby and the daughter she could not release. She returned to the enhanced photograph one final time, studying it with eyes that now saw through the AI reconstruction to the human reality beneath. The little girl, Lydia, no longer looked merely frightened. She looked burdened with knowledge, yes, but also fierce in her determination to bear witness. The doll was not a horror, but a vessel, a container for love that had been transformed by fire into something that could persist beyond death. And the ruins in the background were not just destruction, but evidence of how far someone would go to honor a promise, to refuse to let love be erased by time or circumstance or the judgment of a society that could not understand. The AI enhancement, which had started this entire investigation by revealing what looked like teeth and hollow eyes beneath the doll's veil, now seemed less like an exposure of something monstrous and more like a revelation of something profound. The way love and grief become physically manifest. The way memory preserves not just images, but emotions. The way the past speaks to the present through artifacts that refuse to be silenced. Elena thought about Margaret's words. We create memorials not to trap the dead, but to acknowledge that they lived and were loved. The photograph itself was a memorial, not just to Clara and Rose, but to every mother who had lost a child, every woman who had suffered in silence, every grief that could find no acceptable outlet in the rigid social structures of its time. By enhancing the image, by investigating its story, by refusing to let it remain a curiosity or a cheap thrill, Elena had participated in the ongoing work of memorial, the work of remembering, honoring, and bearing witness to lives that might otherwise have been forgotten. She updated the Digital Heritage Collective's database entry for the photograph one final time, attaching all the documentation she had gathered: the letters, the journals, the artisan's ledger, Lydia's testimony, the film, and the note from Rose Margaret Talbot. Future researchers would have everything they needed to understand not just what the photograph showed, but what it meant, how it had been created, why it had been taken, and how it had endured for 125 years before technology allowed its secrets to finally be seen. On the anniversary of the Whitby Manor fire, December 20th, 2026, Elena returned to the ruins one last time. It was late afternoon, the winter sun already sinking toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the broken stones. She had brought another white rose, which she placed on the memorial plaque she had arranged to be installed. The metal had already weathered, giving it the appearance of something that had been there much longer than 9 months. She stood in silence, listening to the wind move through the bare trees, watching the last light fade from the sky. And as twilight deepened, she thought she heard it again. That faint melody, that lullaby Clara had sung to Rose in the locked nursery. The song that had traveled through Margaret's memory into her journal, through Lydia's testimony into Elena's research, and finally into the reconstructed version that played over the documentary's closing credits. The same melody now seeming to emerge from the ruins themselves, from the earth where mother and daughter had been reduced to ash and become inseparable. Elena did not try to record the sound or rationalize its source. She simply listened, allowing herself to believe for a moment in the persistence of love beyond logic, beyond death, beyond the boundaries of what science could measure or technology could reveal. She thought about how the AI enhancement had brought this story to light, how artificial intelligence had somehow pierced through a century of obscurity to show the world what lay beneath a doll's veil, not horror, but humanity in its most raw and complicated form. As full dark settled over the ruins, Elena turned to walk back to her car. She paused once to look back, and in that moment she saw something that might have been moonlight on the broken stones, or might have been something more, a faint glow emanating from the depression where the nursery had stood, soft and white like roses blooming in darkness, like a lullaby made visible, like love that had finally found its rest. She whispered the words she had read in Clara's final letter to Margaret. Her soul must not wander. And then she added her own prayer to the gathering night. She is not wandering. She is home. The photograph that should have stayed blurred had instead become a window, not into horror, but into the depths of human love and the lengths to which grief will go to preserve what it cannot bear to release. The AI enhancement had revealed the truth, yes, but the truth was not that the doll was haunted or that something monstrous lurked beneath the veil. The truth was simpler and more profound, that Clara Whitby had loved her daughter Rose so completely that she had chosen to die with her rather than abandon her to the flames alone, and that this love had been captured in ashes and porcelain and a photograph that waited 125 years for someone to understand. Elena drove away from the ruins as stars emerged in the winter sky, carrying with her the knowledge that some mysteries, when solved, do not diminish but instead expand to contain more truth than anyone expected. The photograph would continue to exist, enhanced and analyzed and studied, but it would never again be just an image. It was a memorial, a confession, a love letter written in light and shadow and the terrible beauty of grief that refuses to let go. And somewhere beneath a white rosebush in Edinburgh, or dispersed in the ash of Whitby's ruins, or preserved in the collective memory of everyone who had heard this story, Clara and Rose rested together, no longer wandering, no longer separate, finally released from the burden of silence into the grace of being remembered, being mourned, and being loved beyond the grave's ability to divide. The horror was never the face beneath the veil. It was the love that refused to die, and the grace we show in finally understanding why.